September 1675. The war, meant to be contained by the Pilgrims and Puritans in the southeastern portion of Massachusetts, has spread to the fields and forests of the Connecticut River Valley. With the rising of the Nipmuc and the attack on Brookfield, it was clear that it was coming. But with the Norwottuck rising against Northampton, it was a sure thing. And things were going to get a lot worse before they got better. Muddawump, leader of the Quabog, was very well versed in the geography of the valley, knowing its swamps, fields, forests, rivers, and streams. With the Nipmuc combining with the river tribes, it'd only be a matter of time before the settlements in the valley were swept by war. After the events of the 1st of September at Hadley, where William Goff had been forced out of his hidey hole to save the community from an attack by the Norwottucks, the following day, the trained bands of Thomas Lathrop, infantry, 80-plus men, and Richard Beers, mounted 36 troopers, will enter the community. Hadley will, later in the war, become the garrison of the Pioneer Valley. And Pynchon had already ordered that be so, a place where men could concentrate, where material could be stored, and that would necessitate the building of a great stockade. Well, we'll get to that soon. But the point is, it wasn't so at this point. And a day late and a dollar short, these trained bands get into Hadley, and I'm sure that led William Goff to get while the getting was good, because he couldn't trust that amongst these men from the eastern part of the state wouldn't be a spy, at least, from King Charles II, who wanted his head. Be that as it may, on September 3rd, it'll be decided that Richard Beers is going to need to take his troopers north and evacuate the settlement at Northfield. On the 3rd of September in the morning, Beers will set out to evacuate the community of Northfield. He's moving up a valley that is being hit and hit hard from many directions, with Brookfield being attacked at the beginning of August, followed by Northampton. A Springfield attack had occurred against some outlying homes. There's been an attack on one of Pynchon's mills. There's been several attacks in and around Deerfield, where people that are out harvesting and working in the fields have been surprised and paid the price. And now Beers will move north with his 36 troopers, and in this kind of environment, you would imagine that he would have point flankers and a rear guard out. No, he does have a rear guard. His rear guard is a wagon that they're going to try to get corn and other valuables out of the settlement at Northfield. But he doesn't seem to be taking the kind of precautions that normally would be taken. And this is the kind of thing that you see happening over and over again in King Philip's War, where at one point, communities are in the depths and clutches of the greatest fears, and then when the sun is shining, they're just kind of ambling along, and that's what Beers will do. So on the 3rd of September, he'll set out, but he won't reach the settlement at Northfield, and about 5 miles distant, he'll decide to make camp for the night. Now, there's a few reasons he might have done that. He might have felt that the community was under siege, and therefore he didn't want to walk into that in the middle of the night. Another would be that he had little respect for the fighting prowess of the native people, and it was rumored that native people hated to attack after dark. Again, that might be why he should have pushed on, but he didn't. His men were tired, so he made camp, and then the following day, he'll arrive at this ford over the Sawmill Brook. Now, the road that he had been on paralleled this brook, and then there'll be a steep ford, and his men will plunge down and start moving up the hill. No point, no flankers, and they've only got about a third of the way up the embankment when they're hit from all sides by a terrible ambush. Probably the work of the Nashaway war sachem Monaco, but it could have been Muddawump or Sagamore Sam or Philip himself. In the initial firing, probably a third of his men are going to go down, killed or wounded, and the rest will gallop back across the ford, and riding into each other and over each other, they're going to be hit from behind. This is a well-laid ambush, and he's ridden into the throat of it, and now the jaws have snapped shut. he does the only thing that you can do, and remember, Thomas Wheeler did the same thing. He'll ride through a jaw, back the way he had come, and try to break out to get to the field, which is about half a mile away. He'll arrive at that field. Now, the English always felt safe in an open field, and they'll get off their horses, begin licking their wounds, and form up. We don't know how many mounted warriors Monaco and the native people had. Maybe none. But they'll pursue, and from the shelter of the forest begin pouring a desultory fire into the ranks of Richard Beers. About a quarter mile away from where we are now was the initial site of the ambush, where Beers and his men, all mounted, a trained band with 36 troopers, attempted to cross the roaring brook and were hit from all sides. It was a real nightmare. The troopers scattered pell-mell, with the majority coming back this way toward the river, which is just on the other side of the cornfield behind me. On this flat plain, which was a field at the time, they made a stand and attempted to deliver volleys into the advancing native people. They quickly realized that they were outgunned and outnumbered, and after a few volleys, again they scattered pell-mell, with Beers and several men moving up the slopes of a mountain that now bears Beers' name. Around a dozen of Beers' men were able to escape back to the south to the site where they had left their wagon, and they were able to move back toward Deerfield and the protection of its garrisons. Here on Beers Plain, Major Treat, with 3 trained bands of mounted warriors, would arrive on a scene of horror the following day. Treat would be greeted with the sight of a dozen bodies, with the heads mounted on poles, strung out along the path heading back down the river. Entrails hanging as garlands from tree to tree, his men were revulsed. Once again, we see the native people using horror as a weapon to unhinge and unman their enemies. So after riding by the bodies of many of the soldiers of Beers' expedition, many of whom were known by Treat's men, Treat proceeded down the road to Northfield, where he attempted to relieve the settlers and get them back to Deerfield. So the following day, an ambush would be sprung down at Northfield by the Quabog, Pecumtuck, Nashaway, and that would end up wounding Treat severely, and he would be evacuated back, no longer exercising command. But the community of Northfield would be abandoned, and most of the inhabitants would end up making it back to Deerfield, as they say, out of the frying pan and into the fire. By the end of the first week of September, Northfield has been evacuated, with the settlers being pulled back to the security of the garrison houses in Deerfield. There, Captain Appleton, along with our friend Mosley, who's done his very best to rile up every native tribe in Massachusetts he's come in contact with, because in his mind, they're at war with the Indians, and so all Indians can't be trusted. They're either going to be shipped out to Deer Island and watched carefully and closely, or they're hostile. And Mosley's sent up to join Appleton. With Appleton supported by Mosley in Deerfield and the garrison houses protecting the farmers during the evening, the forces of the 2 gentlemen I've mentioned, trained bands of mostly mounted warriors, will begin sweeping the area looking for hostiles. Mosley, who is the most serviced and experienced fighter of them all, beating the bushes as far as he can, indicates that there are no native people to be had. They sweep north out of Deerfield and investigate the Pecumtuck village at Pine Hill, finding none there. And then, as the days progress, they'll see smoke rising from the top of Mount Pecumtuck, realizing they've probably gone to ground up there. And that's about 1.5 miles north of where I'm standing. Meanwhile, to our south, John Pynchon, the commander of the forces of the valley, supported by Major Treat of Connecticut, has gathered half a dozen train bands, and they're preparing to support the actions of Appleton and Mosley here. Pynchon's preparing to begin his own operations when the natives take the offensive themselves. Monaco, the victor of the Northfield Beers Massacre, along with Matunis, Sagamore Sam, Muddawump, and probably Philip as well, have about 700 warriors, and they are watching the situation below and the actions of the forces of the English, north in Deerfield and south in Hadley and Northampton. Pynchon orders that Lathrop deliver the harvestable corn from Deerfield to Hadley to reinforce that settlement, which is being used as the central garrison for the valley. Pynchon fears the advent of a long New England winter. And winters in those days tended to be a little more harsh and hostile than they are today. So one can imagine, in the middle of September, the 18th to be precise, from the slopes of the mountain above, native sachems have watched the riders dispatched by Pynchon moving toward Deerfield. Scouts have indicated that, in fact, a force of wagons and a train band protecting them are moving toward Hadley, Hatfield, and the Central Valley settlements. And this is a great chance for an ambush. Below me is what at one time was called Muddy Brook. In 1675, much of the area that I'm in now was heavily fielded, except for where Muddy Brook crosses the path between Deerfield and the Central Valley settlements of Hatfield, Hadley, and Northampton. And this was a perfect site for Muddawump to set up an ambush. Now, I typically give Muddawump a lot of credit here, but I think that you have to take a look at Monaco and what he had just done to Beers, and you got to give him a little credit too. Now, Philip may have been here. It could have been a combined operation with all the chiefs deciding on what they would do. But when Lathrop arrives at the brook, somewhere along this little S-curve, dozens of trees have been felled across the path. Those trees will provide a perfect lock, a cork in the bottle, to Lathrop's progress. You can imagine that in the shelter of the trees growing along Muddy Brook, the several hundred warriors in war bands from various tribes are watching in glee as Lathrop's men begin to stack arms right about where that vehicle is now and begin trying to clear the trees. With a war going on and settlements all around being attacked, the settlers, part of the train band of Lathrop and drovers out of Deerfield and Northampton, will see hanging from maple trees around the edge of Muddy Brook grapes. The grapes will work as an unbelievable, and you can see grapevines growing up the trees right here. It's hard to say how many grapes had come down in bunches and how many of the English had satisfied their thirst for nature's candy when all of a sudden, out of the forest around me, Matunis, Monaco, Philip, Sagamore Sam, and Muddawump sprang their ambush on Lathrop's men. What happens next is just helter-skelter. We know of at least 2 survivors by name from the site of this ambush. Henry Bodwell, who was clearing the trees here, was known for his outrageous strength. And Bodwell grabbed his wheel-lock musket, whatever it was, and clubbing it, began striking down attacking warriors and runs like the devil himself is behind him in that direction toward what he hopes is safety. And he will escape. A second gentleman, John Tappan of Newbury, will be shot in the leg in the opening moments of the battle, drag himself under some of the felled trees, and lay in Muddy Brook itself and avoid the tomahawks and musket balls of the combined war bands. He will survive, wounded as he is. But the majority of the troopers that are involved in this incident won't be so lucky. We have a monument here on the scene that is a testimonial to the success of the native attack. This is as great of a victory for the native people as we're going to see during King Philip's War. Here, 72 men will fall, the flower of the valley settlements, according to some. Muddawump waits until the men are in deep, their arms stacked, and when he springs his ambush, all hell breaks loose. As I said, a few of the English will be able to make their escape, but most will fall. And Muddawump will pursue them, his braves moving along the road here, and we can see a flag in front of an old 19th century home just in front of me here. Could be an 18th century home. And that flag shows us the center of the battle. And when I say that, the forces of Lathrop, having been ambushed back at the obelisk, will run after an attempt to form some kind of a fighting line failed. Fear grips them, and they will run. And the corpses will be scattered all the way down the road here, maybe beyond those cars we see parked on the right. And here is the oldest war memorial in the United States. Here are buried under a Connecticut Valley brownstone slab the bodies of, I believe it's 72 men who were slain, including Captain Lathrop. And this has been moved around a few times over the years, but I believe it's been placed back in the most central location to where it was originally, with all the road construction and all the progress that's occurred in the community. Although I got to tell you, it's a great place to visit. But the native people will pursue the fleeing members of the train band and drovers down this road, and basically all hell is breaking loose when Mosley arrives on the scene, coming down out of Deerfield. And purportedly, one of the native warriors, one of the leaders, Monaco maybe, will yell, because Mosley's been beating the bushes for the native people, "Mosley, you want Indians? Well, you got Indians." And before he knows it, Mosley and his relief column are hard pressed, and several are killed on the other side of the monument. And some of them are probably buried here as well. It would have been a really hard day for Mama, for Captain Mosley, had not Major Treat, with 3 trained bands of mounted warriors, come down the road from Northampton, maybe 3 hours into the fight. And the appearance of Treat in the afternoon around 5 o'clock will be what is necessary to save the day for the English survivors and Mosley's force. Rather than get into a shot-for-shot battle against a prepared relief force, Muddawump will order his men to fall back to the slopes of Mount Pecumtuck. Battle of Bloody Brook, because that's what the brook will now be named, will be a great victory for the native cause. They've taken out a full trained band supported by drovers. They've badly mauled a second, Mosley's command, and they've stood up to Treat. Basically, this action will lead to Deerfield now being abandoned. So the zone of native control will extend from Deerfield itself, where we are, to the north. They've captured 10, 12 square miles of the valley from English encroachment. It's interesting to consider the attack style of the native people here at Bloody Brook. You imagine the initial shots that would have been fired. Remember, the native people are a hunting culture. They're very good shots compared to your typical English member of a trained band. Shots are fired, and then out come the tomahawks or axes, and in they come for close combat. This is a typical reaction in the age before you get to the long knife or the bayonet. The action at Bloody Brook will set the tone for what will follow, because King Philip's War will become what we might call America's first total war. A war where, in the end, there can be no peace between the warring sides. The valley is in flames. Nearly 100 men have fallen. The English, confident in their superiority, have been licked again, and we move toward an awful October for the people of the Pioneer Valley.